Welcome into Three True Values as we roll through to the second week of our conference breakdown series. This week we are talking about the SEC and the AAC. We'll have two guests in for you today. First will be David Cobb of CBS Sports. Second, we will have Path Upadhyaya on from the Daily Memphian. We'll be talking, of course, in this first segment about the SEC. Talk to David a little bit about what he sees as his outlook as we have this conference start to roll through things. Do they have a case as the best conference in college basketball? We'll talk a little bit about that, break down some of the top teams who will be contenders not only for the conference crown, but in the NCAA tournament as well. Then, when we take a break, we'll come back and talk about the AAC. There is no SMU any longer. Of course, we know Houston, Cincinnati, UCF have all left. Is it really just Memphis and the rest of the basketball teams? It looks that way on paper. We'll talk to Parth about whether that's the case and, you know, what does it mean for Memphis if that is the case? They're a basketball school, so really, can they get where they want to go from that position? Conference realignment has been a topic which swirls around that program. But before we get to our guests today, there's a few teams that we probably won't have time to hit on in this second segment, just because the top of the SEC is so loaded. So I do want to just talk a little bit about some of these teams that aren't expected to be in the conversation. We'll start with Vanderbilt, who really only has one returning player. So Mark Byington, he's got his word cut out for him this season. I do like some of the pieces. I think Jason Edwards, a great defender. Tyler Nickel, he'll be at SEC Media Days to talk. So you know that he's kind of stepped up as a leader. You've got AJ Hogard. That's a good piece right there. And just plenty of other guys who will come in year one and definitely make an impact, but it's going to take time to put all those pieces together. So I do think that this will be a rebuilding year for Vanderbilt. LSU, an interesting one. They bring in Cam Carter. They bring in Jordan Sears. I like both of those pieces. They bring in three pretty highly touted recruits, Robert Miller, Victorious Miller, and Curtis Givens. All play interesting positions where I think that they can get on the court and make an immediate impact for this team. Of course, Matt McMahon, a coach that I believe in. Will Baker returns at center. Damian Collins back with another year of experience. Do the Tigers have something under their belt? I'm not sure yet, but I think that they're going to be in that conversation of dark horse teams that we're going to look at. The leader of the dark horse teams, though, is Georgia. Silas Demarai returns for another year. Blue Kane, a fan favorite. And then some underrated transfer additions. RJ Godfrey, Tyron Lawrence, Deshane Montgomery, Justin Abson, and Dakota LaFew. I think like just about all of them. They bring in Santo Cyril and Asa Newell at the top of their recruiting class. They've got foreign player coming in. I just think that this Georgia team might be underrated because they only have three returning players. But as I look at it, I like all the pieces. Is it going to be enough, though? That's going to be the question. You're playing against some really, really talented teams in this conference. So sometimes being a really good team, you know, if you're playing great teams, you don't look as good as you might be. South Carolina, they're also in this. I hate to leave them so low. I'm sure that there's some South Carolina fans. I'm wearing a South Carolina hat right now, so hopefully they're not too mad at me. But I have them ranked just lower than I think they probably should be. But then again, really deep conference. So where do you put them? They bring in Nick Pringle, Jordan Butler, to fill out that big man position. Colin Murray Boyles, one of my favorite players returning to college basketball this season. Miles Studi can offer them a lot. They've got returning players. I really do think with Cam Scott, their ceiling goes up enough that I could see them being a top 25 team by the end of the year. But I could also see them struggling if some of the pieces don't fit quite how they thought they would. So right now, I've just got them in this tier that includes Oklahoma and Mississippi State, both of those teams. Similarly, we'll start with Mississippi State. I like Riley Kugel. They get him late after he decommits from Kansas. I mean, a guy who was going to play at Kansas, now at Mississippi State, he'll take that anytime. Kanye Clary comes in. RJ Melendez, a really good role player who gives them some front court depth. Cameron Matthews is back. Keyshawn Murphy is back. Josh Hubbard. Josh Hubbard's, I think I had him last year as like an underrated freshman that I just thought was going to get buckets, and he did exactly that. He's going to do it again as a sophomore. And I'm interested to see how he can develop and further his game at the college level. Oklahoma, they bring in an interesting group of transfers. They did a lot of work late in the portal also, it felt like. Jalen Moore, of course, returns, Sam Godwin. But what's going to be the ceiling of this team is this transfer group. Kobe Elvis comes in. You bring in Glenn Taylor Jr. I think he's got a lot of potential. Jeremiah Fears is a freshman, but he joined the class late after decommitting. Mo Waggy, we know he's got defensive upside there as well. Jaden Jones, just Duke Miles, a really good group of transfers, but can they put it all together? And what is the ceiling? Again, this is kind of the theme of this tier of SEC teams that I think are close to the bubble right now. As of today, I think they're all hovering around the bubble, and it's just kind of a wait and see approach of where is that bubble cutoff? What does that look like? We're going to have to look across the country. It's not just within the SEC. Of course, some of these teams are going to separate themselves by the wins and the losses that they have. Somebody in this group, because I'm telling you that there's probably 4, maybe 5 teams, maybe even 6, because if we extend it to Missouri here, which we'll talk about in just a moment, there's only so much room to get all of these teams in. We've already got on the other side of this group that we're talking about now, probably, maybe 10 teams in the SEC who I'm putting in as right now, as of today, I would say are well in the conversation to be NCAA tournament teams. So, there's just not going to be that many more spots for teams to get in based on the way that your record is going to look after you play each other throughout the course of conference play. Missouri, the last team that we'll talk about here before we get to break and bring in David Cobb of CBS Sports. Man, this is an interesting group. I like Jacob Cruz, like Tony Perkins. Marquise Wart comes in. I think he's got some upside. Mark Mitchell, one of those floor guys that I've been talking about, raises the floor of the team. I'm just interested to see how it all comes together and how the roster looks. They've got a lot of freshmen coming in, and freshman-heavy teams have not really been the formula for success unless those guys are one and done, sure thing, NBA lottery pick talent. They don't have anybody who's in that conversation. They got some really good long-term players who I think next year, the year after, they could be fantastic SEC basketball players. I like Missouri's outlook long-term. Just not quite as sold on what they will look like this year. When we come back, we'll talk about more of these teams. We might touch on some of them twice here. It depends on where the conversation takes us, but we will be talking to David Cobb. You're not going to want to miss that as we get in depth on the SEC. And of course, we'll round out the show with Parth Upadhyaya of the Daily Memphian. Stay tuned right here on 3 True Values. We now bring in David Cobb of CBS Sports to talk all things SEC. We are ready to break it all down for you here. Talk about the top teams across this conference, and there's so many of them. I'm looking at this breakdown here, and realistically, could we see double-digit SEC teams make the NCAA tournament this year? I think that's in play for sure, and with these power conferences, we're going to see that Big East record kind of be put in jeopardy, I think, of how many can really crack into that 68 team field. At the top, though, I think that there's a few teams that have kind of separated themselves, at least in the preseason talking points. Alabama right there at the top, Auburn as well. What's it like to see these two football schools become just like dominant basketball programs here in the SEC?
Yeah, a couple of the biggest offseason storylines are who those teams got back, with Mark Sears coming back to Alabama, not to mention Grant Nelson. And then with Auburn, getting Janai Broome back and Dylan Cardwell. You get both those guys back, you got a nasty duo of protectors there. That is such a luxury. Most teams don't have one guy who can protect the rim like Auburn can, but they've got two in Dylan Cardwell, Janai Broome. Janai Broome started stretching his game out to the three-point line on the offensive side, so like he is a lot to handle. And to your original point, yeah, we had 9 of the 16 teams in this year's SEC made the NCAA tournament a year ago when you include Texas. Obviously, they were in the Big 12 at the time. And that's without Arkansas making it. And that's with Oklahoma being just left on the outside looking in on Selection Sunday. So you've got 3/4 of this 16-team league that probably feel like they should be in the NCAA tournament this year. I think the SEC is as good as it's been in a long time.
Yeah, when I look at the top here of the conference and I look at Alabama, I think they have probably the best case to be number one in the preseason rankings, just based off of what they bring back in Mark Sears and Grant Nelson. Latrell Wrightsell, a very underrated piece of what they were doing last year. And then you bring on top of that, they bring in Clifford Omarui, who might be the best rim protector in the country this year, in the middle. And then guys like Chris Youngblood, who's a conference player of the year in the AAC, not some small conference. I mean, one of the bigger, I think they're kind of above mid-major status. And now he's just like, maybe he's going to get the last starting job. Maybe he comes off the bench, and that's the kind of depth that this team has. And then beyond that, just the freshman class as well. They bring in Darian Reed, Aiden Sherrill, Nas Cunningham. I mean, just LeBarian Filing comes in late to the class. I think that maybe, if anything, what Alabama could suffer from is having too many good players, and we've seen that before. We've seen that haunt a couple of different programs in the SEC where they have so many good players that there starts to become this frustration of, why am I not on the court? Do you think that's kind of the biggest threat, or what do you see is the biggest threat for this team to not live up to their potential?
Yeah, a little bit of a logjam potentially there. It'll actually maybe help alleviate some of that Chris Youngblood is probably going to be out until conference play. Can't remember the exact nature of the injury, but it's an injury that he's dealing with. So in a sense, that'll help Nate Oates out of the gate in terms of filing down that rotation, hopefully finding some minutes for those freshmen in non-conference. And then you can sort of figure out via that evaluation, what the pecking order is once league play arrives and once Youngblood is fully in the mix. But I love the Omarui addition, which you mentioned, because if you go back to last season, Grant Nelson got into foul trouble a lot, fouled out of some games, had to play cut minutes a lot of times because he was in foul trouble, because a lot of times he was kind of roaming the paint and played some 4, played some 5. But having Cliff Omarui there, he's going to protect the paint. He's going to be your guy who's bruising against the opposing bigs, which should theoretically free Grant Nelson up, not to get in so much foul trouble and to be more, devote more of his energy to the offensive side of the ball, which is where he's really can be special. So I love what Nate Oates did with the roster. Yeah, it's incredible, man. The fact, one, that they were able to retain him without really too much trouble. Like, he's a name that you were hearing in the coaching carousel well before Alabama even made it to the Final Four. And, Kentucky's open, right? And Nate Oates is like, I'm good at Alabama. And so what does that tell you about Alabama's investment in basketball and like his level of comfort there? It's pretty incredible what he's done. And so it's, when you look back at the SEC that John Calipari walked into at Kentucky 15 years ago, and you look at the SEC now, it's just a totally different world. And not even to mention NIL and transfer portal and all that, all that's helped change it as well. But there's just so many more good teams now because, that first year Calipari was in the league at UK, there were only 4 teams from the SEC that made the NCAA tournament. And there were only 12 teams in the conference. Now it's a 16-team super conference, and you got so many quality teams that you got to go up against night in, night out.
Yeah, I mean, just you talk about John Calipari, and now he leaves the Kentucky job, goes to Arkansas. Nate Oates, of course, was one of those names that it was brought up for that Kentucky job. It ends up being Mark Pope, but I've said for a while now, I think Nate Oates the biggest threat to him leaving Alabama has never been another NCAA team. Like, sure, there's the blue bloods, the allure of that, but he's had everything he needs at Alabama. He's comfortable there. He likes the way that the atmosphere has kind of been created around that program, what he's been able to build up, and he's got clearly all the resources he needs. So I've always said the NBA is the biggest threat to take him away with the style of play that he likes to use, with his interest in just learning basketball. The level of knowledge that this guy has is off the charts. So that's where the concern should probably be turned if you're an Alabama fan, worried about him eventually taking a different job. But now back to John Calipari. He's at Arkansas. He's kind of gone back and forth, I feel like, a little bit this offseason, telling us he learned his lesson. You know, he's not going to bring in all the freshmen, but then complaining about how he has to build the roster. And then, yes, he brought transfers, but plenty of those transfers were just from Kentucky. So how do you balance the way that he has built this roster? Because it's a little bit unique. He's one of those guys that's gotten burned having, quote unquote, too many players. He decided to just shrink it down. He's only going to run a rotation of so many players, and if they get burned with an injury, that's just what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's my concern with Arkansas. You look at what happened to Kansas last year and how they were playing with one arm tied behind their back come late February, and then obviously in the NCAA tournament, almost losing to Samford because Kevin McCullough wasn't healthy. They had other injuries. They had guys get kicked off the team before the season started. And then they end up in a situation where they have no depth and they're playing Nick Timberlake 30 plus minutes a game. Right. I mean, it's like, it was a disaster from a depth standpoint. And so I think John Calipari could have been better served to fill out this roster a little more. They are going to be among the more freshman reliant teams in the SEC, not to the extent that his early teams were at Kentucky. It's not going to be like you got 4 or 5 freshman starters. It's not going to be that level of freshman reliance. But I mean, you're talking about, Carter Knox, Boogie Fland, Billy Richmond III, all these guys probably having places in the rotation. And, it kind of worked last year for the regular season, but then you saw them get into the postseason, and a freshman oriented team at Kentucky really struggled. So, yeah, did he learn his lesson? I don't know. This is also a situation where you're putting together a roster on the fly, and you got to pay pretty big to get a John L. Davis in there, who I had ranked as the #1 transfer in the class. So yeah, we hear a lot about the NIL at Arkansas, and I'm sure it's really solid. But at the same time, the guys that he went out and got, they probably cost quite a bit, which may have handicapped his ability to fill this thing out in a fully robust way. Because you think about it, like Alabama and Nate Oates, like they've already got the core in place, they've got a nucleus in place, and Arkansas didn't have that. I mean, they're bringing back Trevon Brazile. He was the only guy who was on that team last year, so he had to go out and, much like Kentucky did, had to completely revamp the roster. And I honestly, I'm a little higher on Kentucky than I am on Arkansas, which I think is maybe surprising or a little bit counter to what maybe a lot of people think, but I just looked at the composition of those rosters, and I kind of feel a little bit better about how the pieces might work and gel together at UK.
Well, you bring up Kentucky, so we'll head there next. And I think that Mark Pope in year one, my question with this team is 0 returning players. That's going to hurt you. Like, you got to build chemistry with all these guys. And yes, I think that there are a few sure things that they were able to bring in through the portal, but there's a lot of projection, I feel like, here, and not just projection of what they are as a player. Like, you can kind of slot, this guy plays this position, or this guy is good at this thing, but what does having Brandon Garrison look like next to Andrew Carr? We have no idea what that kind of combination, those guards, how will they rotate through, who plays with who. This assumption, I think that Jackson Robinson is just going to be this breakout star. Well, yes, he was very good at BYU, but he was playing a specific role for that BYU team. Are you going to change that up? Is he ready to take on more? I just think that for Kentucky, my concern would be, and I do think that there's a couple of things that combat this concern, but my concern would be having a restless fan base does not work at Kentucky. We just saw it. It just does not work. The last couple of years, you get off to a slow start, you're assimilating a team, and this is a lot of what they were frustrated with Cal doing was, hey, why are you spending the entire non-conference schedule trying to figure out which players can play and which ones can't? Why does it take so many months to get a team that looks coherent? Well, you might have that. Yes, it's not freshmen, it's transfers, but they're still learning how to play together, how to play with each other. And so a little bit of concern there, but he's got such a great relationship with that fan base. It's year one as the coach. They understand that there's nothing in the cupboard. Like they bring back 0 players. So I think that there will be an understanding. Big Blue Nation, they know basketball. They're not going to come in here with unrealistic expectations early, but I'm interested to see how quickly he's able to get this thing rolling, because that's going to dictate what the end of the season looks like.
Well, to your point, one thing that works in Arkansas's favor in the Arkansas versus Kentucky discussion is the fact that John Calipari knows Big Z, he knows Adu Thiero, he knows DJ Wagner, and he knows a handful of these freshmen who were originally committed to him at Kentucky. So there's a familiarity there that doesn't really exist at Kentucky, because Jackson Robinson is coming with Mark Pope from BYU, but by and large, everybody is mostly new to each other, new to the school. So there is less familiarity at Kentucky right now than there is at Arkansas. So that is a potential issue, because it could take them a while to gel. I just like the roles and the individual pieces in the sense that, like, you think about Amari Williams, a defensive stopper, Otega Owe, a defensive stopper, Kobe Brea, an outside shooter, Lamont Butler, a point defender, kind of a spearhead of your defense, right? So like there's all these like pieces that are very well defined at Kentucky, and that's kind of what I like about them. Andrew Carr is your Swiss Army knife forward. Jackson Robinson's your bucket getter. Like there seems to be these lanes for everybody on this Kentucky roster. Will it all gel? Will it all come together? I don't know, but I just like the fact that everybody seems to have the unique potential role there. That's something that stands out to me about Kentucky and about what Mark Pope did with this roster. And you got to like the fact, too, that a lot of these guys are vets. They are well-traveled, very well-experienced guys that have been productive at good programs in the past. So there's a lot there. It's going to be a big test of Mark Pope's coaching ability to see if he can get it all on the same page.
Yeah, for sure. And as we bounce around the league here a little bit more, Tennessee, that's a team that, despite some turnover, I mean, they lose Vescovi, they lose Josiah Jordan-James, Dalton Connect. I mean, that is a huge Jonas Adu as well. Like, that is a huge core of what that team has been for multiple years now. But I look and I say, all right, Zakai Ziegler's back, Jordan Gainey is back, Jemai Mashak. I think that they've got enough there that if a Cameron Carr can have a breakout season, if Chaz Lanier can come in and have that type of production that he had. Now, I'm not going to, it's going to be hard this season because everyone's going to hear like impact transfer and they're, oh, Dalton Connect. And that's just such an unrealistic bar to set for Lanier or Dubar or any of those transfers. But I think that they did really well, Rick Barnes did, in replacing like for like. And that's the thing that I like to see when I see these portal additions, is not necessarily how many transfers you go get or how many people you lost, but did you kind of say, all right, we lost this position, we're going to go get somebody who fills that position or that role, whatever the case is. And I think that Tennessee did a really good job of that.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, Chaz Lanier has the potential to be one of the best transfers in the country. He was such an efficient, high-volume three-point shooter at North Florida. Kind of an under-the-radar guy. For 4 years there, first 3, he really didn't do much, and then he pops off his last year and comes out of nowhere to be this high-dollar transfer. So Tennessee took a lot of strides offensively last season, because throughout Rick Barnes' tenure, especially after Grant Williams and Admiral Schofield moved on, the last few years, they've really been so defensive oriented. So between Grant Williams and Dalton Connect, it was a struggle to score for them sometimes. And their defense always kept them in it and always kept their floor really high. Now you lose Dalton Connect, and I think it does put a lot of pressure on this transfer class, because Zakai Ziegler can score, but he's not a primary offensive option. Jemai Mashak is a great culture piece, defensive tone setter, but he's not going to go out and get you 15 a game. Yeah. And now with Adu going and transferring to Arkansas, he was a good offensive weapon at the 5, and they brought in Felix Okpara, who's going to be a better rim protector and maybe even a better defender than Adu. Yeah. But he's less of a scoring threat. And so to me, that just puts even more pressure on Chaz Lanier, on Darlin Stone-Dubar, who I really like coming in from Hofstra, kind of a versatile wing. Igor Milichitz comes in from Charlotte. So I just don't know, though, where if we're assuming Chaz Lanier is going to be their primary scoring option, who's their number 2 scoring option? What does that offensive hierarchy kind of look like for Tennessee? That would be my biggest question on the Vols going into the season, because I think they'll still be pretty salty defensively. You got enough of that culture that's just built in. You got Ziegler and then Akpara, who I mentioned is going to be a great rim protector. But from the offensive side, a little worried you could see some of that regression back to a scoring struggle if Dubar and Lanier have any sort of issues transitioning to a higher level of play.
It's been the story of the Rick Barnes era there at Tennessee. Can we get the offense going? One team that I don't think will have any problem getting the offense going is Florida, though. Walter Clayton back. They get Elijah Martin. Just a really, really solid team that plays exactly the brand of basketball that Todd Golden wants to play. And so I'm really fascinated to see losing Micah Henlogton. That was brutal for them entering the season, but I really do want to see what this team is able to do. I think that Ruben Chinyelu was an underrated guy in the portal. I actually had people reaching out to me asking if I had seen his tape at any point, and just this idea of like, hey, I'm looking at this guy in the portal and his stats just aren't anything. But then I watched the tape and I'm like, this guy's awesome. So is that what you're seeing too? And I was like, yep, that's exactly what I've seen. So I think he's a guy who could have a bigger impact than what he's going to show in the box score. Like I said, they bring in Elijah Martin to that group of wings. That's just already just, I really like the way that the team is built. I like the way that Todd Golden builds his rosters. And this is just a perfect example of it.
Yeah. He's kind of become the golden child of like this young up and coming analytics oriented type of head coach, and they took a big step last season and played well down the stretch. Got back to the NCAA tournament, made some strides. So getting Walter Clayton Jr. back was so huge for them. He's to me a fringe All-American type of player who all conference for sure, and then we'll kind of see where he can take it from there. And have you seen the clips of this 7'9" guy that they landed?
Olivier Roux, yeah,
dude, it's insane. I don't know if he's going to contribute or be able to do much for them. But whoa, it's like makes me flash back to about 15 years ago. There was a guy named Kenny George at UNC Asheville who was like didn't even have to jump to dunk. And eventually with those guys, it's like knee and foot problems usually catch up to them, But anyway, fascinated by that because Todd Golden really seems to be able to mine big men. Like he finds the bigs who can contribute. And so I think he's got a pretty complete team. It's an interesting mix of some international guys, some freshmen, some transfers, but he's got the core there because he brings back Will Richard as well, who's a veteran wing kind of 3-point 3-and-D kind of guy. So yeah, good pieces there for Florida to take another step. I don't know that I've got the Gators in my SEC title race with like Auburn and Alabama, obviously, Tennessee, Texas A&M. I kind of still have Florida on that second tier behind those guys. But yeah, it's another NCAA tournament team for sure.
Yeah, see, I've got Florida in that second tier there. I think that, like I said, I just feel like Alabama and Auburn a little bit ahead of the pack right now, just based off what they bring back and what they were able to bring in. But I think that this second group is just so wide open. I think pretty much everyone that we've talked about, I've got in this kind of like second group of somewhere between top 15 to a top 40 team in the country. Somewhere in that range, I think, is about where they land. And, we'll kind of get the shuffling through and find out what side of that bar they're in. But you mentioned Texas A&M. That's a team that I'm a little bit lower on than most people. And I think it's just the fact that we've been burned. I mean, just over and over. It feels like they're the sleeper pick every year. They're the sleeper pick for the SEC. And they're the team that, oh, look at what they bring back. Look at what they brought in. And it just doesn't come to be. I mean, they got some NCAA tournament success. They're not a bad team by any means. I don't want that to be the takeaway here. But I can't put them in that first tier. I got to keep them in the second tier. Got to keep them there.
They're a chaos team. That's what they are. They're going to win 8 games in a row, and then they're somehow going to manage to lose 5 in a row and get themselves onto the bubble. And then, lo and behold, they'll make some crazy run in late February, early March, and you're like, oh wow, Texas A&M looks awesome. Hey, I mean, they took Houston. We were there for this. Yes. They took Houston down to the wire in one of the wackiest games of the NCAA tournament this past year in Memphis. That was so unexpected. They were trailing by a significant margin late in that game and somehow came back to force overtime, double overtime, got Houston down to playing a little walk on. That was wild. That was a fun game to be at. But nah, so it's the continuity for me again. And you're right. Like we got burned on this last year because going into last season, a lot of people had Texas A&M as a league title favorite. And so then they have a middle of the pack type of season in the SEC. But then you look back and it's like, man, Wade Taylor is back. Henry Coleman III is back. Manny Obaseki is back. Like, and then they added some pretty good transfers as well. So like they've got the continuity, they got the vets, they've got the potential like player of the year candidate and Wade Taylor. I mean, obviously somebody's going to have to go and take it from Mark Sears, but Wade Taylor's that sort of electric factory kind of guard who, if he can get his efficiency up a little bit, he's an All-American candidate as well. So yeah, Buzz Williams is such a wild card. Like, you just never know what you're going to get from the Aggies, but I wouldn't sleep on them. I wouldn't dismiss the possibility of them coming out and kind of taking this conference by storm.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a possibility. You bring back that the memories of that Texas A&M Houston game. I don't know if we ever actually talked about it. We were on opposite ends of the floor covering that game. When the ball went out of bounds, I got a knee to the head.
You did.
When he came out of bounds trying to go for that ball. So I remember that overtime very well. Yeah, as we move on, though, here, I do want to talk about, before we head out, about this Ole Miss team. And Chris Beard, obviously, it was a controversial hire when they brought him in, but he came in year one, and it was pretty quiet around Ole Miss. I feel like they just kind of went about their business. They kind of built up. You saw some good signs basketball-wise of what they could be. You saw the kind of building blocks of what they were trying to create there. And now we enter year two, and it feels like they've kind of taken this step towards, all right, now we want to become something. You bring in Sean Padula, who I think is going to be an underrated addition to the SEC. What he was able to do in the ACC, I think even in the ACC, went quite underrated for Virginia Tech the last couple of years. I like Dre Davis, Malik Dia, another one that they're bringing in. I really like what they were able to bring in, and I think that it might be time for this Ole Miss team to kind of take that step forward and be what we've seen pretty much every Chris Beard team that has ever been coached has become, which is an NCAA tournament team.
Yeah, I'm really curious about all three of the M's in the SEC, Ole Miss, Mississippi State, and Missouri. Missouri's got to bounce back. Mississippi State gets Josh Hubbard back. They've been to 2 straight NCAA tournaments. And then, yeah, Ole Miss, year two under Chris Beard, you're typically going to see some strides. They started out, 13-0, something along those lines, so against a weak schedule a year ago. And you're like, all right, I can kind of see it. The league caught up to him a little bit. But historically, Chris Beard improves teams pretty quickly. And so you go out and look at what they did in the portal. What's most interesting to me about Ole Miss is how they just wholesale turned over their front court. So they had Moussa Cisse and Jamarion Sharp last season, two of the best shot blockers in college basketball. But I don't know that their defense really reflected the caliber of shot blockers as those guys were. So now they've completely flipped the script in the front court and gotten way more athletic. So you bring in Malik Dia, who you mentioned from Belmont. I got to see him in person last year at Belmont, and he was really good at that level. Level up now. Can he keep up? We'll see. And then Mikael Brown-Jones, who I think came in from Greensboro, but another one of those 6'8", 6'9", like high scoring, floor stretching, defensively versatile type of bigs. But do they have the rim protection? That's a question for me. Can they stop teams from scoring at the rim? That was something that they, at least in theory, were good at last year with those 2 towering 7-footers, but now they don't have that. So I think they're a more agile, more versatile team, a team that's going to be even more explosive offensively. But yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting roster. Like I like what they did in the portal. My question is just, can they stop people at the rim?
Yeah, I do think on that rim protection front, my concerns are a little bit less. And maybe as I'm hearing you talk about it, maybe it should be a little bit more. But I look at John Bolt and I have a lot of questions about what he can do on offense. And maybe that's the concern, is if he can't provide anything on offense, is he going to be on the floor to play defense? But just go watch his AAU tape. Just go watch his AAU tape. Like, that dude's, he blocks every shot. I mean, nobody gets off a shot when he's in the paint. So I think that if he can develop enough to where they can keep him on the floor and make him part of that big rotation with those 3 guys, I think that would help a lot of those issues. But yeah, if he's not ready to go, and we've seen 5-star bigs in that mold not be ready to go as freshmen. So definitely could be a concern there for Ole Miss. Before we get out of here, I want to get your pick as of today to win the SEC, and then your dark horse, somebody not up at the top of this conference. Maybe we didn't even talk about him today, but who could sneak up and surprise everybody.
Yeah, so Alabama's my championship pick. Not going out on a limb there. Look, it's within the realm of possibility that somebody else could win this league. It's not an open and shut case. There's other good teams with good talent, but when you return Mark Sears and Grant Nelson, and you add in one of the absolute best freshmen and transfer classes in the country, and you bring back Nate Oates, there's just a lot to like about Alabama. There's a lot to like about the way they play. They've got enough fire bombers from 3-point range, kind of under the radar transfers who you might not even think about at first glance, but a Houston Mallet who comes in from the Mallet, I don't know, but he comes in from the West Coast Conference. That's a guy who's going to shoot 40% from three for you. There's just guys like that throughout the Alabama roster. So I love what Nate Oates did with that team a year ago. I think he's got a really good squad back. Dark horse wise, kind of interesting what Missouri did in the portal, coming off of 0-18. But you got to remember, in year one, Dennis Gates had those guys in the NCAA tournament. They were one of the most fun teams in the league. And so now can they at least split the difference this year and get back to 500 in the conference? I give them a chance because they went out and they got Mark Mitchell from Duke, who was kind of getting squeezed out at Duke because Cooper Flagg's coming in. So he's a versatile forward who is going to be one of the most athletic players in this conference. He's somebody that really sticks out to me. And then you add in a physical point guard, Tony Perkins, coming in from Iowa. There is a lot to like about the pieces that Dennis Gates put together. And it looked like this offseason he was feeling the urgency, as you should when you go 0-18 in the league. And not to say that was all on him. I know they had a bad run with injuries, but Missouri is one of those teams that I think a lot of people are just kind of, well, they were 0-18 last year, so I'm going to pick them to finish 14th or worse in the conference.
Right. Just slot them down there somewhere.
Just automatically by default. But I don't think when you go through this roster, that's necessarily the right approach. Another guy who I'll mention who was touted to me as this year's Dalton Connect by some people. We'll see, right? We're going to hear a lot about who this year's Dalton Connect is going to be from various folks around the country. But one name to keep an eye on is Jacob Cruz out of UT Martin. My man was like a 40-something% 3-point shooter on mega high volume last year. Just an absolute flamethrower, and that's something they really missed last year. And then I think they're also going to get Caleb Grill back, who could kind of do that same type of thing. So, yeah, I like the pieces that Dennis Gates has. I think he's got a really talented roster. So I will put Missouri in that sleeper/dark horse kind of category.
All right, I like it. And talking about plenty of NCAA tournament teams here throughout this segment for sure. And then Missouri might get added into that group as well. So, David, let them know where they can follow your work and keep up with the latest that you're following in college football and basketball.
That's right. Yeah, it's dual sport time for me, but it's fun. David W. Cobb on the Twitter/X. And then, a lot of college basketball preview content coming down the pipe over at cbssports.com.
All right. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, man. Thank you.
As we keep going through our conference preview slate, we talk about the AAC, and that means we have to talk about the University of Memphis, Penny Hardaway's team. And so I've brought in Parth Upadhyaya, my friend over at the Daily Memphian. He covers that team. He's tied in to everything that's going on. And as we know, there's always a lot going on that beat. So he's a busy guy, but he's carved out some time here in the preseason to talk to us about what all has been happening. They've had plenty of incoming transfers. They've had some staff turnover, and now in a conference that really doesn't have a whole lot of competition on paper, it's time to see what they're able to do. Parth, thanks for coming on today. First off, just walk me through what's it like being the Memphis beat writer and having so much news to cover.
Man, it's constant chaos, which is good for my job, right? Because when there's not chaos, when it's too calm, is when you've got too much free time on your hands and probably boredom, which I don't know what that's like, but there's always a storyline, always something to chase, always a call to make. And that kind of persisted throughout this offseason as well with conference realignment most recently. And then before that, you had the coaching staff changes in September. And before that, you had a whole roster overhaul where Penny Hardaway brought in 10 new scholarship players, 12 new players total, and just kind of revamped, rebuilt, reconstructed his entire, not just roster, but program in general.
Yeah, Nick Jourdain, the only returning player
Yep.
from last year's squad, but he fits a unique category that I've been really interested in talking about and tracking this offseason in particular. This group of players that transferred in and now have a second season under that head coach. They know the system. How valuable is he going to be to this team, having that experience and knowing what Penny Hardaway actually wants?
I mean, aside from Noah Stansberry, who's a walk-on guard, Nicholas Jourdain is the only holdover from last season when it comes to players. So I think it's crucial. I mean, to have none of those guys would have been far from ideal. It's far from ideal as it is, bringing in 10 new scholarship guys, but to at least have one, and to have him in particular, right? A guy who kind of played that glue guy role last year, was willing to do the nitty-gritty things, the dirty work, if you will, was willing to come off the bench or start or really do whatever was required or asked of him, with a positive attitude, with an effort level that didn't waver. I think to have a guy like that is huge, especially, having him here throughout the summer, for the duration of summer workouts. And even before then, before the new guys came on campus, Nicholas Jourdain was, here in Memphis working with Penny Hardaway, almost on a daily basis, from what I understand.
Yeah, and I think the storyline to watch for this Memphis team is going to be the backcourt. Tyrese Hunter, PJ Haggerty. How far can those two carry this team? Because we know that Penny Hardaway's best teams have had that elite guard who's able to go out and get buckets. Do they have two guys who can create that pairing and really lead this team to some success?
I think so. I think you've got two guys that not only can get buckets, but two guys who are different types of point guards, right? We've talked to them over the past week or so. Memphis had its pro day on Thursday, and then they had their blue and gray showcase on Friday. It was. Yep. So we got a chance to speak to both Tyrese Hunter and PJ Haggerty about what that dynamic would look like. Would one guy play primarily on ball, one guy play off ball? What is that pairing gonna entail, right? And they both said it's going to be a 1A, 1B type situation where they're taking turns initiating the offense, taking turns playing off ball, kind of giving each other a breather as needed. So I think that tandem will be cool. You look at most teams that go far in March, they usually have two guys that can be your PG1, right? Mm-hmm. And I think Memphis having two guys who, like we said, do it differently. Tyrese Hunter, more of a true floor general who can score, but is a facilitator, guys involved as vocal as a veteran. And you got Jay Haggerty, obviously younger, only in college basketball for 2 seasons, maybe a bit less vocal, but is a guy that just fills it up from a lot of places on the floor. So you've got a bucket getter in PJ Haggerty, and you've got kind of more of an all-around point guard in Tyrese Hunter. And I think that pairing is going to be one that's fascinating to watch and should work well.
Yeah, and then you talk about the other part of the Penny Hardaway formula, if you will, has been the elite guard and then the center to kind of anchor things. Dane Danger will be the starter, it sounds like, from everything that I've seen. But Moussa Cisse is a veteran guy. Even though he's not a returning player, he's played for Penny Hardaway before, and we know that he is a defensive force, a real rim protector. What kind of value does it bring having those two centers, and what maybe do they get having those two different centers on the roster, being able to play both of them in different situations?
Yeah, I think obviously there are two different styles of players. Dane Danger, from the limited times that we've seen him, once again in the pro day on Thursday and then the blue and gray showcase on Friday, I didn't realize how versatile he was, right? Like, he showed off his bag, if you will. He showed off the ability to dribble the ball from the high post and create his own shot and create for others. A lot of people thought he was just kind of a big body who would, put the ball up and in the low post, but no, this is a guy that can do a little bit of everything, and is a jack of all trades, if you will. So you've got that kind of offensive dynamo of a player, and then you've got Moussa Cisse, who is not the most offensively inclined, as we know, but is a defensive menace, right? Like, is a true 6'10 and a half without shoes, were his pro day measurements. Former Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year, one of the best rim protectors in college basketball, coming off your bench. So I think you look at that, then you look at the front court as a whole, right? So you've got Dane Danger, Moussa Cisse, Nicholas Jourdain, Tyreek Smith. That's 4, in my opinion, starting caliber bigs. Mm-hmm. I think that's huge. You talk about the backcourt. I think the front court is just as impressive, without having the top tier talent that is Tyrese Hunter and PJ Haggerty. For
sure. And I think the make or break for Penny Hardaway's teams in general, and I think it applies this year, is going to be that wing. What can they get from the wing positions? They bring in PJ Carter late. Colby Rogers, I think, is the guy that there's the most optimism around, at least throughout the fan base, for who can provide that scoring punch from that three spot, if you want to call it that. Does there seem to be pressure to get that production? And it's really an interesting spot to be in if you're that three, because you're not supposed to go get 20 points a game like maybe PJ Haggerty will be expected to do. You're not supposed to be a dominant defender like a Musa Cisse or a Tyrese Hunter is expected, but you're going to be expected to keep the flow of the game going, knock down your open shots from the perimeter,
Correct.
keep the ball moving. It's a glue guy role, but it seems to be one of the hardest to fill in the transfer portal. Have they hit the mark here, or is there at least a chance that they hit the mark here with these two guys?
There's a chance. I think they've done it in a way that is not conventional, right? Like Kobe Ryder's a 6'3". He's a shooting guard that's going to play out of position and start for the Tigers most likely, come October 15th against North Carolina. PJ Carter is 6'4", 6'5", and is a backup type catch and shoot guy. They don't have like a rangy wing that can, create his own offense and get buckets from everywhere. They don't have like a David Jones even, who is short but still kind of played that role, right? So you're going to see maybe a different style, different approach to that three position. But I think, with those two guys both being 39% 3-point shooters for their careers, like you've pretty much hit the nail on the head, hit the mark there, if you will. But if you look at just kind of the two glaring weaknesses of the team, the two biggest questions are lack of depth, right? They've got 11 scholarship guys. One of them is a junior college transfer. So you really got 10 guys that are going to be plug and play. Penny's used to having, 13 of them, right? Which has been to his detriment at the time, having too many mouths to feed. Yeah. But this time you're looking at a situation where, a little bit of attrition could really derail could really derail the Tigers if that were to happen. So that's number one. Number two is the lack of shooting. You mentioned Kobe Riders and PJ Carter. Yeah, those guys are 39% 3-point shooters, but there's no other player on their 11-man scholarship roster, the Tigers 11-man scholarship roster, that shoots better than 32%, or that has shot the ball better than 32% from three. So I think that's something that's going to have to happen. Somebody's gonna have to emerge, whether it be a PJ Haggerty or a Baraka Okogie. Those guys have only been in college for a couple of seasons. In Baraka's case, only one season. So you're hoping that 28, 29% clip is an anomaly, if you will, a small sample size that can be overcome and be improved upon if you're the Tigers.
Yeah, and then I think so many storylines with this Memphis team, as we touched on early, but the staff turnover is another thing. It's interesting to follow. And while there have been critics of how much turnover there's been in Penny Hardaway's system the last few years, there's also no doubt that he's brought in really good coaches time and time again. I think this is no different. You bring in two guys to this staff, Mike Davis, of course, and Nolan Smith, guys with real experience. Mike Davis is a head coach, which we know that Penny Hardaway has valued that input from former head coaches. And then Nolan Smith, a guy who was at Duke, at Louisville. He's got high end, like these big blue blood programs.
Mike Davis, a Final Four head coach.
Yes,
a coach
that's correct.
Be in the national championship game,
right? And so,
Bob Knight retired. So
what can those two bring to this staff this year as they try to fill things out? Maybe, obviously, it's going to be Penny Hardaway's system, but what can they provide to this team as we get into the season and coaching these guys up?
Yeah, I think they provide two very unique perspectives, right? You've got Mike Davis, like we said, a Final Four coach, a national title game coach, who's been in the game for a long time and is a veteran, has been there, done that. So you've got that kind of sage wisdom from him. Then you've got Nolan Smith, who's 34 years old and can connect with the guys, can joke with them, and kind of be a little bit more relatable and be that intermediary voice, right, between Penny Hardaway and the players, can kind of fill that role and translate messages from the older members of the coaching staff to the guys who are 22, 23 years old. So I think you've got two different types of communicators, two different types of coaches. But like you said, he's brought in Larry Brown and Frank Haith and Rick Stansberry and Mike Miller. That list kind of goes on and on of these established big name marquee coaches. And it just hasn't worked right quite yet, aside from that 22-23 season where they really made some noise late with Kendrick Davis and DeAndre Williams.
Yeah.
So I think it's going to be about, is Penny willing to be receptive and listen, to the people around him? And if that's the case, if he is, then I think there's plenty of people there that are willing to offer good input and good feedback.
Yeah, and this is an AAC preview. I know we talked a lot about Memphis, and we're going to continue to here. But you had an interesting piece at the Daily Memphian kind of telling people how big of a favorite should Memphis be in this conference. There's no SMU. We know that Houston, Cincinnati, UCF are gone from years past. Should Memphis run away with this? And then the follow-up would be, can they? Because we haven't seen it in years past when maybe they still should have.
Should they? I mean, there's no doubt, right? Like you look at bartorvik.com's 24-25 projections, its rankings, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Memphis is 32. North Texas is 87, I believe. And then you've got a team at 82, that's UAB. So you've got 3 top 100 teams, and then there's no other team in the top 100 of college basketball. That's pitiful. That's pitiful. Memphis has, by far the most talent in the league. It should be able to run away with this conference title, both in the regular season and in the conference tournament. Will it? We've been in this position plenty of off seasons before with Penny Hardaway in this program, and it just hasn't happened. And I think a lot of the fan base is like, hey, show me, don't tell me at this point.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a pivotal year for Penny Hardaway and this program, beyond just this basketball season and building faith within the fan base. You've got conference realignment just out there. It's floating about, and sure, football's the driving force there, but Memphis basketball, I would venture to say, maybe it's not the biggest revenue generator on that campus, but if you're talking to the boosters, they're not even necessarily the boosters, but the big people around town about what is more important, it's that basketball team, especially with Penny Hardaway as the head coach. So a big, important season for them as they continue to try to get investment in the program to try to take it wherever it's going to go moving forward. Parth, thank you once again for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. Why don't you let everyone know where they can follow your work throughout the season? Because as we said, you do a lot of it. I
appreciate that. Yeah, you can follow my work at dailymemphian.com. And you can follow me on Twitter at PUPADHYAYA_. That's Pupadhyaya_ at Twitter or X, whatever you prefer to call it. Appreciate the time, man.
That last name is on the screen here for you guys as well, so you can type it out from here. Thank you once again for coming on, and that'll wrap us up for today's show.